Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel for another how-to video. This time we're going to build and paint the 1/43rd scale Lamborghini Huracán EVO. This is another starter set of a fantastic supercar from a legendary manufacturer, and we're going to build it and paint it using only the contents of the starter set, which is the glue, the paintbrush and the 4 acrylic paints supplied with the kit. On the back of the box, the painting instructions are provided by way of full colour diagrams with call-outs for the supplied paints along the bottom, and these are indicated with the clear white boxes pointing to the model. The small red boxes indicate numbers which relate to the supplied transfer sheet to help with placement. Inside the box you'll find a large bag with 2 frames of white injection moulded plastic and a single piece body shell. In here there's also a separate bag which contains the clear parts covering all of the windows and the headlight lenses for the vehicle. In the smaller bag you'll find the 4 acrylic paints as well as a tube of Humbrol polycement to glue the kit together, and of course we have the ever-present Humbrol Airfix size 2 paintbrush to paint the kit. The small transfer sheet supplied with the model deals with all of the badges and other details which are too small to paint. And there's a fully detailed instruction guide covering the whole assembly process, and it is important that you give this a read before you start your project to make sure that you assemble everything in the correct sequence. There's also the Before You Start guide which details common tools and techniques for model building, most of which we'll cover in the video, but most importantly step 1, to wash all of the parts with soapy water, we'll be carrying out before we begin the build in this video. The tools that we'll be using in this video consist of a pair of cutters to remove parts from the frame, a modelling knife to trim down any excess plastic and also cut the transfers from the sheet, a file to help sand down any remaining plastic from the connection points, and a pair of tweezers to help us position the transfers. Overall, a very basic set of tools. If you're new to building models, you'll find all of the detail parts attached to these frames, which are commonly referred to as sprues. In the centre of each frame there's a large tab which is moulded with a letter. This is to help you identify which frame contains the parts you need. Next to each of the parts there's a smaller tab moulded with a letter and number combination, and this is referenced in the circular callouts in the instructions. To remove the parts from the frame, we first need to cut the frame connection points using the cutters. We do this slightly away from the surface of the model to avoid damaging any of the surface details, and then trim any excess plastic away using the modelling knife. The site of the connection point is then sanded gently with the file to remove any traces of the connection point and remove any excess plastic which may interfere with the fit of the parts. Once we've completed that basic cleanup on all of the parts for stage 1, we can give them a quick test fit in a process called dry fitting, where we press them together without any glue to ensure that we've removed all of the excess plastic and everything fits perfectly. Before we can begin any assembly, we need to do a bit of painting, so we've taken the number 33 matte black from the kit box and we're going to give it a good stir to undo any separation of the paint that may have occurred while the kit was in storage. After stirring for about 30 seconds, the paint's consistency is restored back to its proper state, and we can transfer some of the paint to the palette, where we'll then thin it down with about 30% ordinary tap water. This additional water will dilute the paint, prolonging its drying time slightly, which will allow it to self-level on the surface of the kit and improve the finish. Because we're using a water-based acrylic directly onto bare plastic, there may be some areas where the surface tension of the paint is stronger than the adhesion to the model, causing the paint to bead up. In these areas we need to use short, fast strokes of the brush to overcome the surface tension and just try to get the initial coat of paint down onto the model. The additional water will reduce the opacity of the paint, leading to a somewhat streaky and unpleasant looking finish. However, after leaving the initial coat to dry, we can then repeat the process and add another layer of the diluted black paint over the top. You can see that straight away this really does add to the opacity and starts to build up the colour coverage. The additional water will have allowed the paint to settle down, so what we'll be left with is a much smoother finish than if we'd tried to apply one heavy coat of paint straight from the pot. We can then go ahead and repeat the process on the other parts for stage 1, giving them 2 coats of the thinned down matte black mixture, allowing the coats of paint to dry fully in between. Once the matte black is completely dry, we can then apply a couple of coats of the silver paint supplied with the kit to the suspension components and move on to the assembly section. To apply the poly cement, what we like to do is cut off the upper corner of the starter set kit box to form an applicator. We can then cut one of the flaps from the box itself to form a pallet, and this gives us somewhere to store our poly cement before we transfer it to the surface of the model using the applicator. This gives us far more control over the poly cement than trying to apply it directly from the tube, which does have quite a broad nozzle. The areas where poly cement is required are marked in yellow in the instructions, so using the applicator and pallet setup, we apply poly cement in these areas before pressing 2 parts together and holding them for a few seconds to allow the glue to take effect. With the assembly complete from step 1, we can now move ahead and start painting the interior of the car. We'll be using 30% diluted matte black yet again, and using short fast strokes of the brush to overcome surface tension, just to try and get that sketchy initial coat of paint down on the model, almost to act as a primer for the subsequent layers. While we've got matte black in the palette, we can also go ahead and paint the rest of the interior components, and we'll leave them attached to the frame for this process, as this just helps with handling and also keeps them handily attached next to their part numbers to keep things more organised. Once the initial coat of paint is completely dry, we can go and add our second layer to solidify the colour, and once that's been left to dry, we come across the first of the transfers that we need to apply to the model. Transfers don't work like stickers and instead need to be cut away from the transfer backing sheet using the modelling knife. Once the required transfer is removed and trimmed down, we can then immerse it in ordinary tap water for a few seconds while we hold it in the tweezers and then leave it to soak for about a minute. When the transfer is ready to use, it will move freely under gentle pressure from the paintbrush, and we can then wet the surface of the model with a little bit of tap water in preparation, and then slide the transfer into position. The additional water on the surface will help with repositioning, and we can do this easily using the back of the modelling knife just to pull it into its final resting place. Once that's left to dry, the transfer is added, and we can go ahead and start removing the rest of the interior components and performing the same cleanup process that we did earlier in the video. All of the parts are dry fitted first to ensure that they've been cleaned up properly, and then poly cement is added in the areas marked yellow on the instructions, before the 2 parts are pressed together and held for a few seconds to allow the poly cement to do its work. The large interior assembly now needs to be combined with the base of the model, and there are some nice locating tabs on the rear wheel arches and a recess at the front to help get a perfect alignment. We can now add the details to the interior, starting with the seats. After clipping these from the frame and sanding away the connection point, this has removed some of the paint, so we just need to give these a touch up before we glue them onto the model. This is simply a case of adding a touch of number 33 matte black over the areas where we've sanded away any of the paint. Once those have been painted, we can leave them to dry and then apply some poly cement in the areas shown in the instructions to receive the seats. Once the glue's in place, the seats simply press into their recessed area, and after holding for a few seconds, the seats are fitted. The detail parts for the dashboard were assembled with a little bit of extra care, making sure not to get any excess poly cement on the surface, as this is a very visible area of the model. Once the dashboard was complete, some poly cement was added to the recesses on the front wheel arches, and then the dashboard was glued into position, completing the assembly of the entire interior stage. We can now move on to getting the body shell ready to drop over the top and move on with the build. To complete the body shell, we first needed to snip away the air intake sections which go on either side. The cleanup process was the same, using the clippers, then the knife, following up with the file to ensure a perfect fit. This was dry assembled before adding the poly cement, and when we added the poly cement to this component, we concentrated the glue along the inside face of the model so that when the 2 parts are pressed together, the glue doesn't squeeze out onto the visible face. This way we were able to get plenty of glue into the join and manoeuvre the part into position, but there's no visible glue from the outside. The gloss white paint supplied with the kit was given a good stir to restore its consistency, and then it was transferred to the pallet and diluted with 30% tap water as usual, before being painted on in 2 nice even coats on all of the outside surfaces of the model, including the body shell, the spoiler and the front and rear bumper. Because the plastic of the kit is white, the colour builds up very quickly, and we were soon left with a nice gloss shine on the outside faces of the model. With the outside face of the model painted, it was time to switch over to some detail painting using number 33 matte black. Using the illustrations on the back of the box as a guide for which areas need to be painted, we gently moved our way around all of the detail parts, painting in the black areas. We concentrated on getting the demarcation line between the 2 colours sorted first, before blocking in the rest of the black area. There's a panel line on the surround on the rear window which helps to guide the brush if you locate the bristles into it, and we were able to get a nice neat line between the black and white paint. It's well worth taking your time on this stage, as you don't want to get any black paint on the nice white gloss areas, as this may take several coats to paint over to rectify any mistakes. At this point we decided to push ahead and paint the rest of the detail parts. The wheels and tyres were cleaned up of any excess plastic and the connection points filed away, but all of the parts were left attached to the frame. We then started to base coat these parts in black, starting with the wheels and tyres, but then also giving any part which was going to be silver a base coat of black as well. We built up the paint in 2 thin layers as we've shown previously, and once it was fully dry, all of the silver areas were given a couple of coats of the silver paint from the kit. The black base coat really helps to bring out the shine of the silver, and after a couple of coats these parts were complete, and we also picked out the exhausts on the rear bumper to finish that component off. We then switched over to the gloss red supplied with the kit and picked out the brake calipers. Because the plastic underneath is white, these were really easy to paint, and they had a nice shiny finish in just a couple of coats. The final detail that we painted were the mirrors, and these were given a couple of coats of black paint, followed by some silver. There is a lip around these parts to help guide the brush, but it can be tricky to paint small details like this, so if you're new to building models, you may want to skip this step. With everything painted, we started removing the components for the next stage of the build. The headlight assembly and the rear bumper were removed from the frame, and we removed the clear parts from their individual bag and started to clean up the parts that we needed. Working with the clear plastic is the same as working with the normal styrene, however it is more brittle, so be sure to support the parts during cleanup. We then added polycement in the area shown in the instructions and slid the headlight lenses into place before adding more polycement and then sliding in the headlight assembly that we'd painted silver. The silver part is now trapped behind the clear plastic, giving us a nice realistic looking headlight. On the rear of the kit we added polycement, focusing it along the inside face of the model, and then pushed the rear bumper into position. This was held for a few seconds for the glue to take hold. For the next couple of parts we needed really tight control of the polycement, so we cut some small slivers from the end of the applicator and used this to place the polycement in the recesses for the rear spoiler. A tiny amount was added so it wouldn't bubble up over the sides of the join, and then the spoiler was pushed into position. The same tiny applicator was used to place the polycement in the recess on the side of the body shell for the wing mirrors. The mirrors sit inside this recess, so a tiny amount of glue was added and the mirrors pushed into position. It was then time to clean up the large clear part for the windscreen, side windows and rear window. This was cleaned up in the same fashion we showed earlier in the video, with excess plastic being snipped away before the file was used to clean off the connection points. The body shell was placed on some tissue to protect the paintwork, and then the window assembly was manoeuvred inside into the locating tabs before being gently pressed down until there's a satisfying click as the windows locate themselves in the window openings. Once this was complete, we added the polycement around the inside face of the front of the model and guided the front bumper into position, holding it steady for a few seconds to let the glue take hold. With the body shell completely assembled, it was time to close up the interior. We added polycement around the perimeter as shown in the instructions, and then hinged the body shell over the rear diffuser, working our way towards the front of the vehicle. This was then pressed gently on the desk to seat the two parts together properly, and we held the join closed with our fingers for a few seconds just to give the polycement a head start. A touch of polycement was then added to each of the wheel hubs, and the brake disc and caliper parts slid down the axle and into place. Because of the way the parts are designed, these will only locate against the hub when they're in the correct rotation, so alignment isn't an issue. Once these were added, we moved on to painting the wheels, ready to complete the build of the vehicle. We really wanted to try and get the diamond cut appearance of the alloys as they feature in the box art. This meant that only the outside face of the wheels would be silver and the rest of the wheel would be left in its black base coat. To try and get this effect, we loaded our brush with the silver paint from the kit and then dragged the sides of the bristles gently along the front face of the wheel detail, allowing the brush to impart the silver paint only on these raised edges. This left the rest of the wheel black and gave us a nice silver finish on the front edge to replicate the diamond cut appearance that we were looking for. If you're new to building models, it may be easier for you to just paint the whole wheel silver, and then as you grow more confident in future projects, you can undertake slightly more complex painting procedures. With all 4 wheels painted and left to dry completely, all that remained was to add a small amount of polycement onto the end of each axle and then push the wheels into position. The wheels will locate against the brake disc and caliper parts, meaning that alignment is quite simple and just needs a visual check to make sure everything's nice and straight. With the wheels added, that's the build portion of this model completed, and it was on to adding all of the badges using the rest of the transfer sheet. As we showed earlier, the transfers don't work like stickers and instead need to be cut free from the sheet and then immersed in ordinary tap water just for a few seconds and then left to soak for about a minute. Once it's been left to soak, the transfer will move freely on the transfer paper when it's ready to apply. A small amount of water can then be added to the surface, the transfer slid into position, and then any final adjustments can be made just using the back of a modelling knife to get it into its final position. Once all of the badges are added, that completes the build of the Airfix Lamborghini Huracán EVO starter set. When it comes to choosing our next car, there aren't that many of us fortunate enough to be able to include the Lamborghini Huracán EVO in our list of options. However, when it comes to choosing our next model build, we now have an affordable, fun and easy to build option in the form of the Huracán starter set from Airfix. The reduced parts count and improved build sequence in this kit puts building a replica of a complex supercar such as this one well within the reach of even the most beginner modelers. And by creating videos showing you how to put the kits together, we hope to give you guidance and inspiration to help you on the journey into the hobby. We hope you've enjoyed joining us for some modelling today, and we hope you'll join us again in future as we create more videos of this type. So as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again next time.